Certain stuff is going to be absorbed faster through the basement membrane, and certain stuff is going to be absorbed a lot slower. So if you've got a really, really negative basement membrane, things that are going to go through really, really quickly, what should I do it? I'll do it in blue, are going to be like molecules like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. We can also have other molecules going through. We can have stuff like glucose, urea, creatinine, and we can actually also have some negative ions, despite the fact that that's a negative basement membrane. So we can have a bit of chlorine and a little bit of hydrogen carbonate. The thing with the negative ions is that these will be absorbed a lot slower than any of the positive ones because they're being repelled by this negative basement membrane. Another thing to note is that the reason we don't get amino acids, you get amino acids going through, but the reason we don't get large plasma proteins going through is also because of that negativity. So something like fibrinogen, which is negative, or albumin, which is also very negative, are literally just going to be repelled and exit through your efferent arteriole. That's why if you have a person with kidney failure, they're probably going to have, one of the signs is going to be that they have protein in their urine, and that's why we test for that. So all these molecules are going through, but they're having to go through another layer as well, second layer of filtration. So that's going to be your podocytes, or podocytes, however you want to say it. Podo means foot in Greek or Latin, and that's why they have these little like foot-like extensions, like on the bottom. The extensions that are coming out of them is a molecule called nephrin, and that's what produces the smallest line of filtration. So the gaps between the podocytes are called filtration slits. This is a filtration slit, and this is 20 to 30 nanometers. But then we have the slit diaphragm, which is caused by these nephrin molecules, and that's 7 to 9 nanometers. So really, really small molecules are only going to get through.
Nephrin is the molecule that actually makes the secondary processes.
Yes. Well, the nephrin is the constituent part of that process.
Oh, sorry. 20 to 30 is what distance?
Nanometers. So the distance between the podocytes is 20 to 30. The distance between the nephrin is 7 to 9. So the podocytes are individual cells in themselves, and they have extensions coming off. And there are two different types of filtration. There's filtration slit is the distance between podocytes, and then the slit diaphragm is going to be the distance between each nephrin molecule.
Okay.
That's your final filtration. Problem with that is because that's so small, stuff can get stuck there, and if something gets stuck in nephrin, obviously you're going to have reduced efficiency of filtering through the kidney. So that's why we have these guys. These are called mesangial cells. I'll label that with a better pen. So these are mesangial cells, and their main function is to phagocytose anything that just gets stuck in that nephrin. So if for some reason your basement membrane let through like a plasma protein or something like that, the mesangial cells are going to be the ones that unclog the nephrin, as it were. They also have gap junctions in them which allow communication. I don't know how relevant that is. I assume it's relevant to something or other.
What has gap junctions?
The mesangial cells. That's a funny way of drawing them. I don't think they really look like that, but to help you remember that they're the things that are phagocytosing, I've just drawn them as little macrophages. That's kind of it for everything going through for the moment. The only other thing I'm going to talk about is all the pressures and how much we actually absorb and whatnot. So I'm going to rub off what I've done here. So we've got 4 main pressures, realistically 3 because one of them doesn't do anything, that are acting in this glomerulus that's causing stuff to be forced through. We've got glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which is essentially coming from systole, the arteries pushing blood through, therefore pressure against the walls, and that's going to be going this way, so GHP to abbreviate. We've then got something called CHP, which is capsular hydrostatic pressure. That's caused by, in the same way that in the heart, when you force blood through, it's like an atrium into a ventricle, as it hits the ventricle, it's going to rebound, and that's going to create more pressure. As you force the blood through this artery, it gets forced down, and then because this is so much narrower, it kind of forces it back up, and that's obviously going to go this way. And to repeat, that's capsular hydrostatic pressure. So those two are opposing each other. And then the other ones are caused by plasma proteins in the blood. So that's being the oncotic potentials. So something called albumin, which I just rubbed off there. Albumin, because it's such a negative molecule, is going to start trying to pull those positive molecules we just forced through the membrane back in. So that's called your colloid osmotic pressure, and that's going to be pulling it back in. But then we can write a third force, but it doesn't actually have any value, which would be your capsular osmotic pressure. This is zero pressure itself, but it's the idea that if there were plasma proteins inside the capsule, then they would be pulling positive ions from the bloodstream through. But because of the filtration system, there's no actual plasma proteins there because they've been repelled by that negative heparin sulfate, and therefore it has a value of 0. Annoyingly, that the abbreviation for that is the same as colloid osmotic, so COP again, but that's colloid oncotic, I should be saying. But it's a COP, but that's capsular oncotic potential. So we can kind of use those values to generate a general value for glomerular filtration rate, which in normal-ish circumstances is about 125 mmHg per minute is.
You know the second capsular oncotic pressure?
Yes.
Is the arrow that way or that way?
It will be
It's
the other way around.
way.
Sorry, yeah, the other way
Okay.
around.
Sorry.
No, that's my mistake. Let's do it like that. Yeah. So we've got two opposing to bringing it in. So if we start to break down like what's actually happening, realistically, the amount of blood that's actually going to get through here isn't huge. We have about in normal sort of like resting state, we have about 1,200. I think it's something like 1,200 mil or something like that per minute coming in. I know the values of 1,200. I need to double check the units. 1,200 coming through, but obviously because blood is made of like that's by volume. So yeah, by volume. So we have 1,200 coming through like roughly per minute due to the heart pushing it through. But because obviously blood is made of lots and lots of different constituent parts, you have the hematocrit, which is where all your red blood cells are and that sort of thing, and you have all the plasma. We're not forcing through all the red blood cells and stuff. That's still exiting along with a little bit of plasma so the blood doesn't like clot up here. So obviously only a portion of that is going to get through, that's going to be the plasma. The amount that gets through is about 625. I'm going to say mil, and I'm not sure on that, I need to double check. But it's 625 gets into the actual glomerular filtration, the area essentially. But of that 65, because all the plasma proteins being repelled and other negative molecules aren't really getting through as fast as the positive ones, only about 20% of that 65 actually makes it into the capsule. So we end up with 125 actually making it through.
Then the rest of yours will be mil per minute because that's what I've got.
It is in mil per minute, so that's how much blood we're actually getting into the capsule. And as you can imagine, there's a balance there between obviously how much pressure we're forcing it through and also what the area in which we're forcing it through, like the surface area, as well as the permeability. So if there's a load of plasma proteins stuck in this nephrin, then we're going to have less going through because less stuff's going to be able to get around it. As if you blocked a sieve, so to speak. So I'm going to have to rub this off because we're pretty much done with glomerulus now, and I'll just write out the kind of nicest way to show that balance.
As you rub it out, can I just ask a question? You
Sure.
know that 1,200 mils per minute, is that blood
Yes.
or plasma?
That's blood. That's
Okay.
that's all blood, hematocrit and all. That's what's coming into those arteries, and then the rest of it. The 65 is blood, including like plasma proteins and whatnot. That's what's being forced through, and then everything else is just what actually makes it through. So plasma and like a small amount of negative ions, etc.
Thank you.
So I'm going to
positive ions.
positive and negative.
I know.
It's just really small amount of negative versus a
Right.
very large amount of
Got
positive.
you.
So I'm going to put GHP at the top. Come on. GFR, not GHP. But GFR at the top. That's going to be 125. And then obviously, so like I said, we've got a balance between two different constituent parts that's going to make up that figure. And we've got our net filtration pressure, and we're going to work that out with those pressures I mentioned earlier. So that's going to be the general like way of thinking about it is we have the pressure forcing out minus pressure, forcing in. So if we start adding up like what we were doing earlier, we've got GHP forcing out plus our capsular aquatic. This is both COP, I always forget. It's just a pain in the ass. And then we've got colloid osmotic, another COP, and our CHP, so capsular hydrostatic pressure. I meant to get the figures for all these, and I have them written in my other notes, and I've forgotten to put them on that poster. But if you do that, essentially, you end up with 125, which is where that figure comes from. But then also there's this other consideration, because when we get the figure of 125, we're assuming that what I'm about to talk about is constant, which is our surface area and our permeability. We assume that they're constant, and then we can just purely base it off the pressures. But coming back to this, what we can say because of that is that our net filtration pressure is directly proportional to glomerular filtration rate. So coming over to this side, like I said, we've got a balance of surface area and permeability. And obviously, higher surface area, we're going to have higher glomerular filtration rate, higher permeability, higher glomerular filtration rate. And we can start to quantify these, but when we start to quantify these, we end up with something called KFC, funny enough.
Let's go.
Owen really should have been here for this.
Yeah, literally. Which is basically the product of both of those equals something called the filtration coefficient, which is KFC. So what we can then equate is the fact that KFC is directly proportional to GFR, so KFC being directly proportional to glomerular filtration rate. But then that means that those two are also directly proportional. So eventually we end up with a figure that says that GFR is directly proportional, or, well no, actually no, we can say that it equals actually KFC times NFP, the net filtration pressure.
So many acronyms.
Yeah, it is. It's a bit of a mouthful, especially when two of them are the same.
You should probably have like an index at the end.
Yeah, literally, like, yeah. So that's our final equation. How do we measure that in practice and whatnot? We use either inulin or creatinine. I'm not sure what inulin is. I'm assuming it's like a metabolic breakdown of insulin, something like that. Creatinine is definitely the metabolic breakdown of creatine, which is in the muscle cells. Why do we use it? It's freely filtered. It's not reabsorbed. We'll come to later. Not secreted, not metabolized, and easily measured. Easily measured because it just comes out straight out in the urine. Essentially, it just goes through the nephrons and do anything. That's why we use it.
Use this to do what, sorry?
So that's what we're using to measure our glomerular filtration rate.
Like in hospitals and stuff.
Yeah. So you work out like you put a concentration in, wait a few hours. Someone has a piss, and then you like measure the concentration. You see how much has gone through in said amount of time. I think we use creatinine more in clinical scenarios, even though I think it's slightly secreted,
because it's made actually by the body itself.
Yeah.
So the inulin isn't, because it's actually kind of expensive and difficult to do.
Yeah,
because it has to be administered by IV.
Ah, right. Okay.
Which is what she said. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the glomerulus done. The only thing I will quickly mention as well is the idea of osmolality, because we're going to come into that later in a second. So osmolality is a measure of the amount of water in a substance, in short, or the concentration of water in a substance. That's in opposition to osmolarity, which is a measure of the amount of substance in water. So if I had a block of like butter, I could measure the osmolality by how much water is in a kilogram of butter. But if I was measuring like osmolarity, I could measure the amount of sugar that's in a volume of water. That's why it's measured. Osmolality is in milliosmoles per kilogram, and osmolarity is in milliosmoles per litre or milliliter. The reason we use osmolality when we're talking about the kidney is because it's not dependent on temperature. So stuff dissolves more at a higher temperature, but water doesn't dissolve more at a high temperature, like in a substance. We're going to come on to that in a minute. I'm going to put at the top here that in the glomerulus /cap, the osmolality is equal to 300 milliosmoles per kilogram. And we're going to come to that in a minute. So now obviously you have a big old windy thing, and we come to the PCT. PCT, there's a lot of mechanisms in here. There's quite a lot going on. So I'm going to try and go through each one individually, but don't be too stressed because there's a lot of mechanisms here, but they kind of all just repeat themselves later. So I'm going to quickly draw out a few cells, a few neighbouring cells, and explain what's going on with all the iron reabsorption and whatnot. So first thing I'm going to talk about is reabsorption of amino acids. In pretty much all of these examples I'm going to talk about, there's this one very specific type of channel which is going to be transporting sodium out and potassium in. We do potassium. It's the same as the active potential ones, which is 3 out, 2 in, same like the repolarization. These are active channels, they use ATP. And I think they're sodium, potassium, ATPase channels, something like that, from memory. So what that's obviously going to do is mean that the concentrations of sodium in this cell is going to be relatively low because we're trying to shove all of it out. So we're going to have low sodium and we're going to have high potassium. That means that the channel down here, which is going to be transporting our sodium passively in, it's going to move down its gradient. Also, this channel also allows small amino acids to come in with it. It's a syn-porter, so they both move in the same direction. This is an example of something called secondary active transport. So it's secondary active transport because while this doesn't need ATP, this is a passive process. Without ATP, it wouldn't happen. So it's a secondary form of it. That's going to come up a lot in all of these examples. What happens to the amino acids once they get into the neighbouring cell? Well, we've got a blood vessel there, and the amino acid is going to diffuse back into the bloodstream through another channel and be reabsorbed. So that's one of them done.
That's completely passive. That process.
That's passive. Then I'm going to go for this one's a bit more complicated. It's a way you're excreting. So it's a way of excreting CO2 that isn't through respiration, and it's also a way of regulating pH, specifically blood pH. So in our blood vessel here, we've got CO2. CO2 can diffuse into here, and it can combine with, inside the cell, H2O. That is going to be a very familiar mechanism because that's going to produce carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is going to dissociate to H+ and Hc3O-, or carbonate ions, or hydrogen carbonate ions. Sorry, that's going to come up a lot in this. That's the we've done that before, I assume. The enzyme doing this is carbonic anhydrase. We did grade level. So what the whole point of this is now we've got hydrogen ions in here and hydrogen carbonate here. The hydrogen ions are going to diffuse back into the nephron through another one of those co-transporter sodium channels. So we've still got these pumps making the low sodium concentration, high potassium concentration. So sodium can passively diffuse in, and as it does it, we have what's called an antiport. So our hydrogen ions that I've just produced here go the other way. So they're going opposite ways and helping each other in some way, essentially. Once our hydrogen ions are out here, in the glomerulus, I said that one of the negative ions that we pumped out was hydrogen carbonate. So the hydrogen ions here are going to react to the hydrogen carbonate we just forced out from the glomerulus. So what we end up producing is carbonic acid. That then dissociates again, but using a cellular bound carbonic anhydrase enzyme back into H2O and CO2, and then we can excrete that CO2. That water's probably going to be reabsorbed at some point during the pendy or the collecting duct or whatever, but we can excrete the CO2 that way. That's one mechanism. And then what happens to my hydrogen carbonate ions we've just left in here? They're going to diffuse back into the bloodstream. And because hydrogen carbonate is a base, that can combine with any hydrogen ions or any positive ions really, and then that will bring the pH down. But it's not that's a regulatory mechanism, but it's not a specifically it's not the main one, if that makes sense, but it will have a side effect of doing it. Something a little easier, This is the plasma membrane, this is the plasma membrane. Lipids can just go straight through, and they're just going to diffuse straight back into the bloodstream. Interestingly enough though, the lipid we're most interested in is actually urea. So urea can just diffuse straight through because they've got really low concentration in this artery, sorry. That means that urea just passes straight through the membrane because we've just filtered it all out. So that's passive.
Surely you don't want that, though.
Well,
It happens a little bit.
we reabsorb about 55% of like the urea there. We don't reabsorb all the urea, but we reabsorb like an amount of it because there's this concept of urea recycling, which I'll get to later. Because it like stays in the nephron, essentially. It doesn't get struck back into like your heart and whatnot.
I see.
Other ones, I said we had another negative ion that's come through, and that's chlorine. And again, it's going to be that same mechanism of Na is going to diffuse in, chlorine is going to diffuse in, with Na using a syn porter because we've got low concentration of sodium in here. And chlorine is just going to be totally reabsorbed through another channel. And you start to see this, a lot of it is like very, very similar. We end up with 55% of my chlorine being reabsorbed there, of like the amount that you filtered out earlier. Then we can talk about glucose, that's pretty bloody important, and also lactate. Lactate is another one that is going to go by the exact same mechanism. So if I sit down and do this one, again, sodium's diffusing in, glucose is diffusing in, doing the exact same thing again. So glucose is then going to come out back into another blood vessel down here. We're going to reabsorb. I just put the percentage on there. Yeah, so we're going to reabsorb 65% of our glucose like that by that mechanism through those channels, and then I'm going to put this up here as well. We're also going to reabsorb 65% of our sodium, which is quite important. Obviously, this is through. I'm not going to put it just on this channel because it happens through all of these through the same mechanism. But I'm going to say 65% Na reabsorbed because that's important later. There's a couple more mechanisms which I don't know if were actually covered in the lecture. There's stuff about glutamine. I don't know if we ever did it, but I'm going to go through it anyway. It's quite simple. So we've got glutamine in our neighbouring cells, which are diffused from our blood vessels. Glutamine, because it's an amino acid, can be deaminated, and that produces different colour. 2 hydrogen carbonate and 2 NH3. NH3 can react with hydrogen ion to produce ammonium. 2 ammonium specifically. And then that ammonium can then diffuse through a channel here back into the tubule. That can then set up a dynamic equilibrium of it being converted back into ammonia. And it's just another excreting ammonia essentially, and how you break down glutamine as an ion, as a hormone. The HC3H, the hydrogen carbonate ions in that case, are going to just diffuse back into the bloodstream in the same way they did, and that's another regulating pH. They're going to react with hydrogen ions. There's 2 more. One of which is I haven't spoken about one of the last things on kidney function 1, which is the idea of drug breakdowns. So there's you have anions, organic anions and organic cations, and how they're reabsorbed, and how basically how drugs are broken down. And it's like a 3-chain mechanism essentially. To start with, we have again, So we have again these sodium potassium pumps that I keep mentioning, which are active, which are transporting sodium out and potassium in. But then we have another channel adjacent to that, which is going to actually retransport our sodium in. But as it brings the sodium in, it's going to bring a dicarboxylate in at the same time. Don't worry too much about that, it's just a breakdown, and it's kind of like an intermediate, because we then have another channel adjacent to that, which brings our dicarboxylate back out, and it brings in our organic anion, so negative ion, back in with it. So an organic anion is going to be something like, it can be urea actually. That's another way that urea can be brought back into the nephron. penicillin, or
Yeah, it says here bile salts,
bile,
fatty acids.
that's from like a BS then. I was like, that's not what I'm thinking it is. Yeah, bile salts as well. And then essentially they can be, the organic anions can be brought into the nephron and then excreted. So it's a way of getting rid of drugs essentially, or some drugs. So we do this big old loop, and after about here, this is the medulla and then this is the cortex, and we end up like crossing, we end up just bridging that gap. Not particularly relevant, but apart from if I start talking about like the medullary interstitium, that's this part. Cortex interstitium is that part, which is the outer sections of these, like of the nephron. So, like I said, we have the osmolality coming out of the PCT is 300. The osmolality then starts to increase as we go down. So, what the figures are 700. It's not defined or anything. It's just obviously it varies with like how much water you're like drinking and whatnot as well. But as general figures, that's what I'm going to put it as. And the reason for this is much easier explained if I start with the descending limb. So on our descending limb, on the diagram that I've got here, I've oversimplified it